The Dragonslayer armor fight is often encountered third from the end in the any percent, and marks the beginning of a tough final act for first-time runs. The nature of this fight often allows players to reduce it to a relatively scripted event. With the run deep and the stakes high, it's always a good idea to capitalize on this in some form. We'll cover a few of these approaches in their full context before getting into any of the finer details of the fight. We'll start with the strat that utilizes the highest damage and requires the fewest player attacks. This is as close to a true one cycle as you can realistically get. The strat can be described in two segments, setup and finisher. During the setup, land 3 L1s and an R1. Attack once or twice as openings permit. Once you've dealt your setup damage, retreat to the fountain. Bait a 3-piece combo or a jumping attack, and use the fountain to block it. Apply pale pine resin. Once you get your next opening, attack DSA with 3 L1s and then rotate around him to either side, as shown. Close back in and attack with 4 additional L1s. Roll with the two-handed swipe, and the next L1 should kill him. Keep close to his body prior to rolling backward. This will prevent you from needing to jog forward to land the next attack, which could give DSA time to lift his shield. I've seen the strat executed with 5 L1s prior to the two-handed swipe, but there's a good chance he'll get the attack off before you fit in all 5. You're often lucky enough to be in a dead zone of this hitbox if this happens. Even so, another problem is the potential for a partial hit on the 5th L1, in which case he won't die anyway. The crux of this particular one-cycle strat is stamina management. The key moments to watch out for are the opening where you choose to start your finisher and the scripted transition attack. When you move to start your finisher, give a brief pause if needed. You'll want to ensure your stamina is completely full prior to attacking. And when you go to strafe the following scripted attack, keep sprinting minimal or avoid it altogether. You could run out of stamina and be unable to pull off your final L1 in time, or worse yet, have to roll the axe. Needless to say, if you have to roll the transition attack, you're firmly off script and will need to improvise. Don't force the rest of the strat at this point, it just won't work. By this point in the game, you should easily have 45 dex or more, which is just enough for this strat to work. A similar strat involves fire bundles rather than pale pine resin. The setup and final execution are the same. 3 L1s, a single R1, and then the 3-4-1 finisher after bundling. One nice thing about this variation is that you don't need to bait an attack near the fountain to buff. Another is that the dex requirement to pull this off is lower, at least down to 40. The one minor downside is that you'll need your window to both regain stamina and bundle prior to pushing phase 2. You'll just need to be a little more discerning in your openings to account for this. The required rings for both of these strats are RTSR, Flynn's ring, and Pontiff's right eye. In the 4th slot, you have the option of Chloranthy or Karthus Blood Ring. This can be a bit of a tough choice in my opinion. Karthus Blood Ring offers nice insurance and peace of mind. This is especially true if you find yourself early rolling DSA's two-handed axe attacks sometimes. On the other hand, I've already mentioned how tight these strats are on stamina. Any little boost in this regard is helpful. Unfortunately, Grass Crest Shield lowers the Flynn's Ring damage boost enough that these strats no longer work, so it's Chloranthy or nothing. If you'd like a strat that affords more comfortable stamina management at the expense of needing one more punish, consider the following. Instead of closing back in and executing 4 L1s prior to his opening two-handed attack, go for only 3 L1s. Roll with the swipe and punish once, like before, or roll past it if you'd prefer. He should now be 1 or 2 L1s from death, depending on whether you punished after the sweep or not. With the right openings, there is no difference here in the number of attacks needed. In fact, you can now use Grass Crest Shield and approach the fight with slightly lower dex, without the drop in damage presenting any real impact. If you want even less to worry about, just buff right at the beginning of the fight. This is the strat I used for my first any percent, and the one I'd personally recommend the most. It's more relaxed on buffs, doesn't require every last point of stamina to pull off, and makes it easier to avoid the mindset that things have gone awry if you don't get the one cycle. Many times, you can still pull this off without seeing a single butterfly attack, and only on a truly bad day would you expect to see more than one or two. We'll cover all these attacks in depth later in the guide, so that even these shouldn't be cause for too much concern. Many runners will use the aforementioned strategies while also limiting the number of attacks dealt with. The tendency is to focus on baiting out one particular combo and then landing one or two attacks. The combo in question is this one here: 2 horizontal slashes followed by one of 2 overhead attacks. The most common way to approach this combo is to roll back from the initial slash, outspace the second, and then strafe the third. This third swing is fairly simple to strafe even while locked on. However, I would recommend unlocking if you can. Make sure you're light rolling to achieve adequate spacing for the second swing. Another approach is to roll into both slashes and strafe the third. You're more likely to get the standing variation of the overhead attack if you do it this way. Either method works just fine. The latter might come more naturally if you choose to play the fight at close range. You may even get this overhead as a standalone attack if you stay up close. The same method of strafing it can be applied for additional punish, just exercise caution about when and where to do it. Keep in mind that this attack can be overstrafed. Another very simple punish is the lightning weapon art attack. If you're close by when he starts this attack, get around him and keep a few feet of distance. Don't stand too close, as the hitbox extends a bit behind him. If you're using a weapon such as the broadsword, you can charge an R2 while he charges this attack. Land the R2, then follow up with a single R1. If you're right up against him when the attack starts, and react quickly with an agile weapon, you can sneak in a hit during the windup. Be sure to quickly move away before the attack lands. This strategy has some payoff if you're using Frost as a damage source. If you're unable to get behind him, either due to distance or if his back's to a wall, just run away a bit. There are a few additional attacks you can opt to punish if you prefer to keep the fight moving along. I would also recommend learning at least some of these if you're running the Grass Crest route and buffing right at the beginning of the fight. One good example is this front-facing shield slam. You can roll into this attack at any angle and land one L1. You'll want to be on your toes following this maneuver since he can respond quickly with a number of attacks. In particular, you'll need to be quick to react to his shield bash. You can also outspace this attack by jogging away from him before it lands. Don't try this if you're late to respond or right up against him when the attack starts. Handling the attack this way isn't the greatest example of risk-reward, but can provide better visibility on his next attack. This attack also has a quicker variant that is an infrequent follow-up to other attacks. It can also appear on its own, in rare cases, as an attempt to punish the player for attacking. You can sneak in one punish after his 2-piece shield bash following a roll. This combo is signified by the sort of galloping motion he takes between the 2 bashes. Mind the slight delay before the second bash. One of DSA's attacks comprises 2 wide swings with his shield. I would hold off punishing this attack, as he can follow up with a quick shield slam. Even if you roll past the first swing, he can still follow up, and the second swing is wide enough to dead angle the player. Rolling past him to the right, though, can put you in a good position to bait out a strafable attack, which we'll get to later. This backhanded shield slam is a great attack to punish. It has an exceptionally long cooldown, allowing 2 L1s following a roll. If you can strafe this attack, you even have ample time for 3 L1s. We'll cover this shortly. On the other side of DSA, he'll utilize another backhand attack, this time in the form of an axe slash. You can roll this attack for a comfortable single punish, or strafe for 2. DSA has a 5-piece combo. It begins with 1 horizontal slash, followed by 1 shield slam, then a galloping bash, then 2 wide shield swings. If you can bait out all 5 pieces, you can tack a punish on the end. Whether or not this is worth it is up for you to decide. If you're feeling particularly daring, there is room in between the 3rd and 4th piece for a single punish. Finally, DSA has a couple of attacks he'll perform as gap closers. The first is this jumping axe slam. He'll often follow this up with a quick shield slam as well if you stay out in front, and rarely one of his wide shield swings after that. Because of the unpredictability of follow-ups, it's best not to punish if you don't get behind him after the initial axe slam. If you do get behind him, you can safely take a single L1. The other gap closer is this leaping shield slam. It has no follow-up as far as I'm aware. You can comfortably punish once after dodging, strafing, or even outspacing this attack. If strafing, 2 is doable. The fight will always open with one of these 2 attacks. The best way I can tell to differentiate the 2 is the amount of pause before each attack. The shield attack begins with a much longer pause. Circling back to these 2 backhanded attacks, if you can learn how to reliably strafe them, you can create an abundance of punish opportunity by deliberately baiting them. To bait the shield slam, pause for a moment around his 7 o'clock. You'll want to stand a foot or so off his body. If you're too close, he's more likely to jump back. The starting position you'll want is right about here. Move toward his body, across his chest, and at a bit of space. Continue moving across until the shield lands, and then safely land up to 3 L1s. Some good opportunities to do this are after strafing one of his leaping attacks, such as during the opener, or after rolling past him to the right. In the case of the leaping attack, attacking him once from this position should help bait out the attack, while still leaving you enough time to maneuver away from the attack. If approaching him idly from behind, pause in this spot for a split second, then jog toward the front of him. It's a bit trickier to pull off in this context. It's easy to maneuver out of this position before he takes the bait. At the same time, you don't want to linger here too long and understrafe, or be forced to roll. If you're thinking of incorporating this in runs, spend a good deal of time with it in practice first, and err on the side of caution. To bait the backhand axe attack, you'll want to do the same thing, except on his 5 o'clock. As you strafe the attack, move inward toward his body, as well as across. This contrasts with the previous attack, in which you want to move slightly away from DSA, as well as across. With a weapon such as the broadsword, you can safely begin attacking during the active portion of the hitbox, provided you're positioned far enough to the right. This is best to avoid with twin blades, since the attack will raise your character model a bit, potentially putting you in the way of the hitbox. Just wait fractions of a second, and you'll still have time to take 2 L1s. If you put all of this baiting and strafing together, you can actually kill DSA in a highly scripted manner using only +6 twin blades. This can be handy if you're trying to optimize the route for a shorter run. You'll need to play fairly aggressively to avoid losing stagger buildup. With roughly 40 decks and a fire or pale pine bundle, you should push phase 2 in 6 L1s. Keep to the 3 attacks at transition, followed by 3 attacks as he goes into the two-handed stance. Roll the next attack, and try to bait another one of these 2 attacks. He should stagger in 2 to 3 more L1s, after which you can land the kill. It's arguably a better idea to use Lloyd's Ring for this fight rather than RTSR, since it lines the stagger up more nicely. If you do use RTSR, you might push phase 2 in 5 L1s, depending on your build. You could try incorporating an R1 as setup if you desire. If you don't land the kill exactly by the book, you'll have a little more phase 2 to deal with than you would have otherwise. Still, it shouldn't be more than a couple extra attacks as compared to the same situation with +9. There is also an optional strafe on the two-handed sweeping attack. As he pulls back and prepares to lunge forward, jog toward the blade of the axe. The lunge will push DSA forward, leaving you behind the hitbox. This is kind of risky, especially since he can cock back at some awkward angles, but it does a pretty good job of priming the backhand shield bash as the next attack. And of course, it saves some stamina. This is essentially a modified version of the speedrun strat for DSA, with a few extra considerations made for safety. Anyone with some time in the DSA fight can describe how frustrating it can get when he decides to turtle behind his shield for extended periods of time. Most runners will simply wait out this bad RNG until he inevitably stops and provides something useful to the player. This is probably the safest option in truth. However, if you're a little impatient like me, you can attack his shield with an R1. This will usually bait an attack and get the fight going again. The attack he'll most often perform is this delayed shield rush. This attack is designed to catch panic rolls following the weapon knockback on the player. Be sure to delay your roll a fraction of a second, then land one attack. I like to roll back with the attack and slightly to the left. You can adjust this direction to your advantage, say if you wanted to bait out a particular follow-up attack. If you roll directly back with this attack, you can sneak in 2 punishes. Keep in mind, he can respond with basically any other attack, and rarely, not at all. In Phase 2, he'll always follow up this delayed shield bash with a unique Phase 2 attack. Most often, the jumping attack or the charge. More to come on that. Kind of like Dancer's Idol, there is some rhythm involved in attacking the shield. If mistimed, the quick shield bash can spell instant death. What happened here is that he went for an attack at the moment I went to smack his shield. This situation with this exact attack is what makes doing this a bit risky. Any other attack from DSA will usually leave you time to roll. DSA does gain some additional attacks in Phase 2, all of which start with him assuming a two-handed stance. There is the sweeping attack, which is his opening attack of Phase 2 proper 98% of the time. This one was already covered during the general strategies discussion, so we'll skip over it for now. The next is the air disc. He'll plant his axe on the ground and then hurl a shockwave at the player. This might be the most important to pay attention to, since it is his only ranged attack outside the Pilgrim Butterflies, can travel the distance of the arena, and will require different roll timings depending on range. Rolling through the disc is the safest and most ideal method, though not always viable given the circumstances. In many scenarios covered later, this attack will be seen most when you're forced to retreat. If you're at a distance and no longer retreating, this attack is an excellent opportunity to regain position. If you do happen to get this attack from somewhat close range, you can close the gap with a roll and then land a single L1. At even closer range, you can run around his right side and get behind him. The attack will miss entirely, and you'll gain an opportunity for a double punish. If you're at a decent range, say 40% of the arena or more, you can also side sprint this attack. Just make sure you're in full sprint before the disc actually comes out. Next is this jumping attack. You can roll or strafe this depending on your comfortability with the attack. Be aware that it tracks in the air and also lands later than you might expect. This is a good attack to take a single punish and then position yourself for a follow-up bait. If you strafed it, you could also double punish and then evade the next attack. While he can perform this attack on its own, it's more frequently seen as a follow-up to other attacks in Phase 2. Finally, there is this charging attack. He'll run after you, dragging his axe along the ground before executing an uppercut. He'll often follow this with an overhead slam, which can easily catch a panicking player. The first portion of this attack has a rather small hitbox. Just roll to his side early on, and it'll almost be harder to get hit by it than not. If you end up at his hip, you'll have a good opportunity to strafe the overhead follow-up if it comes. If not, mind your timing and be careful not to roll early. This follow-up is the same as the overhead attack in Phase 1, so just treat this one the same. If you happen to get a bit of a distance on DSA during the charge, he may not follow up at all. Before we move on, I mentioned that the two-handed sweeping attack is the opener of Phase 2 98% of the time. In rare circumstances, he can perform any of the other 3 attacks. It seems partly based on position, and partly upon really funky RNG. I wouldn't worry about this too much. Also, if you're in striking distance when DSA goes into the two-handed stance, you can take 2 L1s before he does any attack. The other oddity regarding these two-handed attacks is that he'll sometimes cancel a stagger. This happens if you knock him down as he's assuming the stance. It's really bizarre looking, and I'm tempted to write it off as a glitch, plain and simple. Just be aware of this if you're approaching the fight in a way likely to stagger this boss. This includes +6 twin blades, great swords, and clubs, among others. What concerns the majority of players about Phase 2 is the Pilgrim Butterfly attacks. These are the 2 entities flying outside the arena to either side, which are actually controlling DSA. The butterflies have 3 attacks: small orbs, affectionately referred to as meatballs, lasers, and a single large orb, or giant meatball. All 3 of these attacks have unique sound cues that precede the attacks by several seconds. Here are clips of the audio for each. We'll address the small orbs, or meatballs, first. It is largely due to this attack that you'll always want to stick to one end of the arena or the other, rather than hang around the middle. This will provide ample room to retreat as the projectiles let loose. The second, equally important piece of advice I can provide for dealing with this attack is to not panic and run away immediately. From the time the audio cue starts, it will take 3 to 4 seconds before these orbs actually start firing. If you're in the middle of dealing with a punishable attack, you can often get a punish in before you need to retreat. Otherwise, hang around and evade for a couple seconds, then start running. You'll want to outsprint these projectiles and save rolling only for dealing with overlapping attacks from DSA, or if you feel you've started moving late. The next of these attacks is lasers. The main thing to consider with this attack is that they will never land on your immediate position. A laser fired from barrack side butterfly will always barrack side, just as one fired from archive side will always land archive side. In other terms, a laser from the left will always land behind the player, whereas one from the right will always land in front. Just like small meatballs, there's no reason to rush off anywhere right away. In fact, as the lasers actually fire, you want to either stay still or move away from the direction in which they're firing. Finally, there's Giant Meatball. The safest way of dealing with this attack is to use the fountain to block it. You will likely have to dodge some melee attacks at close range, preferably by rolling directly into the fountain. An alternative approach is to sprint the length of the arena in a straight line, and either use the pillars on the outside of the arena to block, or watch and roll the attack. The issue with watching the attack is taking your eyes off of DSA, and then getting smacked with an air disc. If you're on point with your timing and audio cues, you might be able to roll it blindly off sound alone. If you elect to use the pillars, keep in mind the tall ones don't have collision on the top half. Make sure the projectiles either collide low, or that you use short pillars, and maybe just roll for safety. Now that we've covered each of these attacks in their own right, let's cover some of the difficult combinations that can occur. We'll start with the doubles, when 2 of the same butterfly attacks are happening at the same time. Of these 3, double lasers is easily the tamest. As mentioned before, the lasers will never land directly on the player, so long as you're not moving toward them. The biggest complication with double lasers is that they can trap you in a small area for a couple seconds, but this really isn't a big deal. Just work on rolling all DSA's attacks at a close range and you'll be fine. When it comes to double small meatballs or double giant meatball, both have the potential to be quite problematic. Small meatballs are their most problematic when they occur about 3 to 4 seconds apart. This is just close enough to prevent you from doubling back the other way before the second set, leaving you with less than half the arena to work with. All the concerns over retreating too early and not having enough room to begin with really come to a head in this scenario. If they occur more simultaneously, the length of the arena covered by this attack won't be as bad. If you absolutely run out of arena and the meatballs are still firing, you can hang out in the corner of the door closer to the direction of fire. This is by no means perfect, but should block some of the projectiles. Unfortunately, you may not even be on the correct side of the arena to do this. The same trick of using the fog gates to block small meatballs in a pinch works for giant meatball as well. You can even use the adjacent wall in this case. When it comes to double giant meatball, the closer the two occur, the more problematic the situation is. The good news is that getting 2 giant meatballs fired so close together that you can't just use the fountain to block both is exceedingly rare. The bad news is that it's rare enough that I gave up trying to get a clip of it for this tutorial. Instead, I'll do my best to describe the worst case scenario and talk through how to manage it. The scenario plays out as follows. If you're using the fountain to block from one side, you're left wide open on the other. If you try to sprint and roll the attack, staggered hitboxes could pose an issue. If you've got good situational awareness, using a short pillar to block one and rolling the other one could be an option. You could also position yourself about 15 feet away from the fountain, and then sprint past as the two fire off. If you line this up well, one will crash into the fountain, leaving you to sprint and roll only the other one, and possibly even force a collision on one of the pillars. The latter is probably what I would do in this situation. You can also get combos of dissimilar attacks, and some of these are pretty rough. The two worst are probably laser and small meatballs, and small meatball and giant meatball. I'll go ahead and say laser and small meatballs comes with an asterisk next to it. It's only problematic when the lasers fire ahead of the direction in which you're running. Obviously this cuts off your escape route, leaving you exposed to the line of fire. Depending on where you are, you could try and use the fountain to block. Using the fountain to block small meatballs is much more precise than using it to block a giant meatball though. Each butterfly is offset from the center of the arena lengthwise, so you'll likewise need to offset yourself for the proper lineup. On the other hand, if the laser is firing behind you on the path of retreat, it's as if the laser doesn't exist at all. In the case of small meatball and giant meatball, the concern is the projectiles chasing you off of any obstacles you might use for blocking. In this situation, you may need to roll the giant meatball while being cognizant of both the small ones and DSA himself. Laser and giant meatball aren't too bad in most situations. The only odd exception that comes to mind might be if giant meatball queues up and then laser comes shortly after and cuts off your path to the fountain. And this goes without saying, but on top of all these scenarios, you'll need to keep an eye and ear on DSA as well. Particularly if you're retreating, there's a strong likelihood that DSA will fire his air disc attack at you. If you're dealing with small meatballs, you don't want to try and side sprint this. You'll have to roll with the disc, which of course tightens the timing a bit. If you're doing a low damage run, Blood Ring could help for these sorts of situations. DSA can be parried in Phase 2 on any of his two-handed attacks. There's not really a lot of reason to do this, and I've never learned the timings, so I'll stick to just mentioning it in passing. If you're wanting to use special damage types on DSA, keep in mind he is immune to bleed, but extremely weak to frost. Either Irithyll weapon and a torch will completely chew through him, proccing frost every 2 hits where you can land a double punish. If you're looking to capitalize on the recently popular Dagger route, it's not all that bad for DSA, depending on how you play. It doesn't quite shine as much as it does on other late-game fights like Princes and Cinder, but if you're willing to engage in a highly aggressive playstyle, it does offer a good deal of potential. You won't get as scripted of a quick kill as +6 Twin Blades, though it comes fairly close, and in addition to that, there is far less fuss over stamina management. If you're baiting attacks, especially the shield slam, the quick step can provide an extra safety net without consuming as much punish opportunity as a roll. Helpful if you're still getting the hang of this strat, or just wish to be extra careful. You can even take some additional punish this way with room for 3 comfortable hits after this particular opening. You won't want to try it with every attack, but there are a handful for which you can sneak in some mid-combo hits. Feel free to take advantage of this between any of his shield bash combos. Do not try this between the 2 horizontal axe swings, the window is too tight. You can even pre-attack a couple of his combos, but this is exceptionally tight, and probably never worth it on a hitless run. Perhaps the niftiest things you can do are quick step both the transition attack and the lightning AoE. These are both a little risky as well, but more worth it than the pre-attacks for sure. I've played around with this using both the one-handed and two-handed movesets. It's noticeably easier to whiff attacks when one-handing from certain positions. You'll need to jog in closer during scenarios like phase transition to mitigate this, and even then, it will take some practice. Two-handing simplifies this aspect at the expense of a fraction of your attack speed. If you care about squeezing every ounce of optimization out of this approach, one-handing is probably the way to go. If you want something a little comfier, and plan to forgo the tightest punishes anyway, two-handing might be the better option. Just like Princes and Cinder, it's a really fun way to fight DSA, and overall, pretty good. As with those two though, it's not worth it if you're not aggressive. In fact, I'd say the demand for aggression might be even higher with this boss, to really justify it. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. Feel free to leave comments or questions below, or via DM on Discord. And as always, good luck on the runs.